I'm going to go through this process with you. Now, does everybody have a chart? We're going to start with the back side where it says inner bonding definitions. You can look at the top part of that whenever you want, but I'm going to start with the bottom, and so that we're all on the same page regarding definitions. Now, when I say core self, or I say essence, or I say soul, or I say inner child, I'm meaning the same thing. This is the spark of divine within us. We all have a spark of the divine within us. And this is who we really are. This part of us is so magnificent, so beautiful. If you've ever had a child and you looked in the child's eyes and you saw the light in there, and you started to feel the individuality of that child, the essence of that child, that's what I'm talking about. And we all came into life with that beautiful essence. But what happened for many of us is that we were born into parents, like I was, who had no idea about their own essence. And if they had no idea who they really were, then they couldn't see us. And in fact, what happened is they projected their own insecurities and their own false beliefs about who they are onto us. And what happened when we didn't get love is that we only had one of two ways of understanding that. Either we were absolutely brilliant, and frankly, I've never met anybody like this, who said, you know what? My parents are clueless. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know how to love. This has nothing to do with me. And they either checked out because they said, I'm out of here. I'm not going to stay with this. Or they found other ways. They connected with an animal, or they connected with a neighbor, or another relative, with somebody who helped them get through. But what the rest of us did, and certainly everybody I've met, is that we decided that the reason we're not being loved is because there's something wrong with us. We're not good enough. We're inadequate. We're flawed. We're defective. We're just not important enough. Now, that's the beginning of the ego-wounded self. That's a core false belief, a core shame false belief that there's something basically and intrinsically wrong with us. Now, as I said, virtually everybody that I've met has that belief on a deep level. And so what happens, as soon as we absorb that belief, and it may even be before you're born, it may be in the first year of life, it may be at 5 when you go to school, it could be at any time. But as soon as we absorb that belief, then we take our essence, this beautiful, wonderful part of who we really are, and we start to hide it away. Because we're saying, well, if I'm not good enough, if I'm not lovable enough, then I got to hide who I am. And then I've got to figure out how to be in order to get love and avoid pain and feel safe. And I remember thinking, if only somebody would tell me the rules. What are the rules? I'll do it. I'll follow it. I'll be what you want me to be. Just tell me how to be. But of course, you know, those rules didn't exist. And so I went about pushing away my essence, like everybody I work with, and developing what we call in inner bonding the wounded self. This is the ego part of us. And this part of us is located in the amygdala, the lower brain. This is the fight or flight aspect of us. This is the survival aspect of us. We all have this. And, you know, we needed to learn to survive. And so we developed many, many false beliefs. Not just, I'm not good enough or I'm inadequate, but, oh, if I do things right, or if I never make a mistake, or if I'm perfect, then I can have control over getting love. If I look right, if I perform right, if I achieve right, then I can have control over getting love. And so we developed a lot of beliefs about being able to control getting love and avoiding pain. And this is what the wounded self is all about. It's about trying to have control in order to feel safe. Of course we wanted to feel safe. Everybody wants to feel safe, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so we had to develop that aspect of us. The problem is that then we grow up, we get into relationships, we're still doing the same thing. We're still feeling like we're not good enough, we've got to prove ourselves, we've got to give ourselves up, or we've got to get angry, or we've got to withdraw to not be controlled, we've got to resist being controlled, we've got to do everything perfectly, we can't make mistakes, we've got to drive ourselves on and on. We create a lot of stress. Now, how many of you know that research indicates that 90% of illness is due to stress? How many of you know that? Well, you might want to look that up, but the research indicates that stress, what stress does, you see, what stress does in the body is that it puts the blood into the arms and legs for fight or flight. But at the same time, it's robbing the immune system and the organs of the blood and the nutrients that it needs. So if you're operating out of a lot of anxiety and fear, what's happening is instead of this fight or flight response operating because you're being mugged or you're, on a safari and you've gotten attacked by a lion, I mean, that's what it's there for. Instead of that, you're creating this stress by your thinking process, that your thoughts are scaring you. They're telling you all the bad things that are going to happen. They're telling you everything that's wrong with you. How could you have said that? How could you have messed up like that? If you do this, this is going to happen. It's going to be a disaster. On and on. This is what the wounded self does. It goes on and on about what's wrong with you and what's going to happen. That creates a lot of anxiety. Now, when you're in the jungle and a lion attacks, your fight or flight goes in, and you either fight or flee or freeze. If you freeze, what happens is that all the energy gets locked up in your body, and this is what happens with people with PTSD, people who have been abused. It all gets frozen in there and creates a ton of anxiety. And the same thing happens when we're telling ourselves these things. We're not running. We're not fighting. It's just going on and on. And so every time this happens, our immune system is losing what it needs. At the same time, the blood goes into the lower brain, not the upper brain. And I don't know if any of you have had the experience, you get into a fight with your partner, and suddenly you can't think well, you can't remember what it is you wanted to do, and that's because, that really does happen, and that's because the blood leaves the upper brain. We can't think as well. When we're triggered, when we're angry, when we're scared, when we're anxious, we don't think as well. And so, of course, that exacerbates the problem. So while we needed that wounded self, and this is the second part of this first page, we needed that wounded self when we were growing up to survive. Now it's really, really getting in the way. And that wounded part of us needs to get healed. If you want to attain real health, you've got to heal the false beliefs of your wounded self. You've got to heal that monkey mind that's going on and on and on and causing you anxiety or depression or guilt or shame or anger or aloneness or emptiness. You need to do healing, and inner bonding is an amazing process for doing that healing. So let's move to the third, the loving adult. And the loving adult is what inner bonding is about, developing. The loving adult is who we are when we're connected with our higher self, whatever that is for you, whether it's God or whatever your concept of God is, or whether it's your own higher self, the highest, most glorious part of you, whether it's a spiritual teacher, whether it's a light, whether it's something that exists within you, your own inner wisdom, or exists without, it doesn't really matter. But it's beyond your wounded mind, so that you can tap into a source of wisdom. And so the loving adult is who we are when we're connected with that, And we're open to learning about learning to love ourselves. So the essence part of us just wants to express ourselves. How can I best express all that I am? And the wounded self says, what can I do to be safe, to get love and avoid pain? And the loving adult says, how can I love myself? How can I best support my own highest good and share my love with others? Okay, let's turn to the life paths chart. And if we can get that up on the screen, I'd appreciate that. There we go. Okay, so there's two paths in life. There's always two paths. Jesus said there's the wide path and the narrow path. This we call the earthly path of fear and the spiritual path of courage. And because we have free will, we get to choose which path we're going to be on moment by moment. Nobody holds a gun to our head and says, you have to try and control and protect and avoid. And so we get to choose whether we want to, and if you look at the chart here, you'll see that the left side is the path of the wounded self, the right side is the path of the loving adult, and that we have choice, and we can choose to control in the face of fear, or we can choose to learn about love in the face of fear. It's not about not having fear. It's not realistic on this planet to not have fear. There's a lot of scary things that happen. So if you think, well, I can't love until my fear goes away, that's just not true. In fact, it's learning to love yourself first and then share love that actually makes the fear go away. So I'm going to go down this middle section and help you to understand what the inner bonding process is all about. And then I'm going to ask for a volunteer, and maybe you can think about somebody who has a specific issue that you might want to very briefly deal with, an issue in a relationship or an issue about anxiety or depression, a shame that you might want to deal with. I'm going to ask you to come up and we'll do a brief little session so that you can get an idea of what the inner bonding process looks like. And of course, that's going to be brief. I mean, sometimes when I work with people, like I do 5-day intensives and there's only like 12 or 13 people, and sometimes we'll work for an hour or two. But here we're going to have a short process. So, okay, so the purpose of the wounded self, as you can see, is to get love and avoid pain. The purpose of the loving adult is to give love to self and share it with others. So the desire of the wounded self is to get our good feelings, our worth, our lovability, our safety externally from others, from situations, from approval. Now, imagine that you have a child, and instead of you giving child love, you go around to people and say, do you like this child? Is this child okay? Do you want this child? Do you want to take this child and give this child love? Because I don't want to do it. Now, what would happen to the child? The child would feel deeply rejected and abandoned. Well, this is what happens on the inner level. If you think about our feeling self, our essence, as an inner child, as soon as we go outside of ourselves for approval, as soon as we try to control somebody else's feelings about us, we are right away rejecting ourselves. We are saying, I do not want responsibility for defining my own worth. I want somebody else out there to define my worth. And for me, one day I realized, wow, this is a really hard way to live, to always have to be on, to always have to worry about what somebody's thinking. And you know what? How do they know? How does somebody else have the authority to define your worth? And what I realized is that the only one who has the authority to define my worth is my higher guidance, my higher self. And in the inner bonding process, we teach you a very simple way of connecting with that higher wisdom. And so one of the things that I learned that made a huge difference in my life is to define my own worth, my own goodness, my own lovability, And that makes such a difference, because then I don't need to look to other people. I don't need to be thinking, oh, what are they thinking of me? Am I doing okay? Am I saying the right thing? How do I look? How am I performing? I don't think about those things anymore, because I have defined myself as a basically good human being. What if you decided to define yourself as a basically good, caring, lovable human being? Well, then, if other people were rejecting you or disapproving of you, it would be so much easier to not take it personally. You could say, well, that person's having a bad day, but this doesn't have anything to do with me. So it becomes very important to be learning to define your own worth. And so that's the desire of the loving adult. The loving adult finds joy and peace and safety and love and worth through a spiritual connection, through your connection with a higher power, rather than externally with somebody else. Now, this very much affects relationships. Imagine two people getting together and each person not feeling great about themselves and thinking, well, I need a relationship in order to feel lovable, in order to feel okay. Now, one of the things I've learned in all my years of doing this is that we attract people at our common level of self-abandonment or our common level of self-love. So, if you're a person who's not loving yourself and you're feeling insecure and you're looking for somebody, oh, if only this person will come along and love me, then I'll be okay. Well, then you're going to attract somebody who's also looking for somebody to love them. So you get together, these two wounded people, not loving yourselves, and at the beginning, you're giving each other a lot of attention, a lot of approval, but it doesn't take very long before you start to feel like you're not getting the love you want. And the other person starts to feel they're not getting the love you want. And you think, maybe I made a mistake. I picked the wrong person. But no, that's not the issue. Because if you don't do your inner work at that point, you're going to pick another person who doesn't love themselves and is looking for love. And so learning to love and value yourself puts you in the position of being able to attract people who are also loving and valuing themselves. And I got to tell you, this absolutely works. This is the law of attraction. Like attracts like. And so the more you love yourself, the higher your frequency goes, the rate at which you are loving. And that attracts loving people. And so to expect to have a really loving relationship when you're not loving yourself is unrealistic. Now, that doesn't mean if you're in a relationship and you're having problems, this can't be healed. It can, as you learn to love yourself. And what happens with so many of the people that I work with is that even if only one person of a partner starts to do inner bonding, starts to learn to love themselves, they shift the entire system. One person shifting the system changes the entire system. So if you're motivated to learn inner bonding and you're in a relationship and your partner isn't, don't despair. Most of the people that I work with who do their own inner bonding work, their relationships get better and better. And eventually the partner might say, gosh, I really like what's happening with you. What are you doing? And then they get on board with learning to take loving responsibility for themselves. Okay, so going down the chart to intention, as I said, the intention of the wounded self is to protect against pain and avoid responsibility for feeling it and managing it. And the intent of the loving adult is to feel, learn from, and take responsibility from our pain. Now, all of our pain has information for us. Pain is informational. Like if you're slicing an onion and you slice into your finger, it's going to hurt. The pain is telling you something. It's telling you you're slicing into your finger and you got to stop what you're doing. If you had numbed your hand with Novocaine before slicing the onion, you wouldn't have felt the pain. And you could actually do yourself great damage if you don't feel the physical pain. Exactly the same thing is true on the emotional level. Our pain is here to tell us a lot. Our anxiety, our depression may be telling us that we're abandoning ourselves. Our guilt and shame may be telling us that we're coming from a whole lot of false beliefs. Our anger at others is often a reflection of how we're not taking care of ourselves. Now, anxiety and depression, as I said, can come from other sources. It can come from eating really badly. It can come from a gut that's not balanced. There's a lot of reasons for it. But one of the reasons is self-abandonment. And so I work with a lot of people who have eaten really, really well, and yet they still feel anxious and depressed until they start to practice inner bonding. And they realize that their anxiety and their depression has come from their self-abandonment. And as they learn to love themselves, they're no longer anxious, depressed, guilty, shame, angry, empty, alone. It's very, very powerful. So, moving down to the reaction to pain, you can see on the left side of the chart that the moment we move into the intention to control, to protect, to avoid, our heart closes down. In fact, the whole body closes up. We become contracted. And out of that contracted state is where we turn to a lot of different ways of trying to manage the pain. And I'd like you all to take a minute to look over the reaction to pain of the wounded self. Just take a moment to look over the addictive, controlling behaviors that we turn to. And just tune in to what do you do? Are you addicted to manipulating others with a whole lot of different forms of controlling behavior? Are you addicted to people, to getting love or attention or sex? Are you addicted to substances, to sugar and alcohol or drugs or nicotine? Are you addicted to activities, to surfing the TV or to being on the internet or turning to porn or gambling? Or there's so many. Just take a moment to look over all the things that the wounded self has learned to do to cover over pain, to avoid pain. And then, of course, there's all the medications. There's the anti-anxiety, antidepressants that people take to numb out their pain. Now, you know, all drugs have a very negative effect on the gut flora. And antidepressants, anti-anxieties, any drugs, they all have a very negative effect on the gut flora. And so that also contributes to illness. But when you numb your pain with any of these addictions, and you numb your pain with medication, you are operating blind. Your pain is filled with information. You need that pain. Now, we have two kinds of pain. It's important to understand this. We have the wounded pain that we cause. This is what I've said, the anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, anger, aloneness, emptiness, jealousy, revenge. We cause this by our self-abandonment and our false beliefs. But there's another kind of pain, and this I call the core pain of life. This is the loneliness that we feel when we want to share love with somebody and there's nobody there to share it with, or the person who's there is shut down. This is the heartache and the heartbreak that we feel when people are being unloving to us or to themselves or to others. And the sorrow we feel at like even what's going on in our world with our food and our toxicity and all of that. And it's the grief at losing loved ones. It's the helplessness over other people and over situations. These are very, very hard feelings to feel. And when we were little, especially if we weren't being loved or if we were bullied at school or any difficult things that happened when we were little. These are the feelings we felt, but we couldn't afford to feel them because when you're little, if you don't have somebody who's very loving holding you and comforting you, you actually can't manage those feelings. They're too big, way too big for little children. And so when we were little, we had to learn to avoid our feelings. We learned many ways of abandoning. Basically, we learned 4 ways of abandoning ourselves. One is we learned to go up in our head, to stay focused in our mind, like I did. Stayed focused in my mind, completely disconnected from my body. Didn't know what I felt. Took me years after I started to practice inner bonding to be able to know what I felt in a moment. And so many of us, we practice staying in our minds so that we don't have to feel what's going on in our bodies. That's one form of self-abandonment. Another is that we learn to judge ourselves very harshly. Like I said, all these judgments, I'm not good enough, I didn't do it right. That's a big form of self-abandonment. Then we turn to all these addictions, all these ways of avoiding our feelings, substances, processes, people. Another big way of avoiding our feelings. And finally, we take our inner child and hand him or her away to somebody else. You make me feel okay, it's your job to love me. That's a big form of self-abandonment. In fact, the minute we do that, the minute we make somebody else responsible for us, we've already rejected ourselves. We've already abandoned ourselves. And so whatever happens after that, you think you might be feeling rejected by the other person, you've already rejected yourself. You're already going to feel rejected once you make somebody else responsible for how you feel. And so you're perpetuating not feeling good enough the moment you participate in these 4 ways of abandoning yourself. And I've never met anybody who hasn't learned to do at least some of these. Everybody I work with, when they come to me, they are suffering because they have abandoned themselves. Now, if you go down to the bottom of the left side, you see that while doing these things may numb out the feeling for the moment, like grabbing a donut or something, which I hope none of you do, it comforts for the moment, but in the long run, it doesn't help anything. Like if a child comes to you upset, and instead of addressing the child, you say, oh, here's a cookie, go watch TV, the child is pacified for the moment, but what's happening doesn't get addressed. So when we do these things, the fear increases. We become more insecure, more unsafe. And just take a moment to look at the bottom of the left at what the consequences are for yourself individually and in a relationship. This is where the sadness, the depression, the anxiety, guilt, shame, the jealousy, this is where the codependency, the caretaking, the lack of passion in a relationship, the lack of feeling safe, all of this comes from the self-abandonment.